May we have your attention, please?
Welcome to another podcast about road driving risk. If an accident actually happens and the police arrive on scene because the accident has been serious enough to cause injury or death, do your drivers know what to do? And more to the point, do they know what to say and not say? To answer those questions and expand on that a little bit more, today I have with me Charlotte Lemaire from Arch Law and Andrew Drury from Road Safety Smart. Welcome both of you. Charlotte, could I ask you to introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Hi, Ant. Yes, thank you very much. I'm Charlotte Lemaire. I'm a criminal and regulatory lawyer at Arch Law. I've been dealing for the past 2 decades with serious road traffic collisions and also serious regulatory and health and safety matters.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And now, Andrew, please.
Afternoon, Ant. Yes, thank you. My name's Andrew Drury. I've been a collision investigator for the last 21 years, maybe a little bit longer. Employed a number of investigators during that time. I think I had up to 30 at one point, working together. I've investigated the process of over 40,000 collisions in that time. Not all serious, but the minor collisions lead to the more serious incidents, which is what we're going to talk about today. So that's me, and look forward to this, Ant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Let's get straight on with my first question. Andrew, could you talk to us about why road traffic collisions are not seen in the same way as other health and safety incidents that might occur in the workplace?
That's a really, really good question to start the session, Ant. I think Charlotte and I both agree over the years that health and safety within the workplace is quite regulated, or is very well regulated. We've got lots of rules, policies and procedures. But as a general rule, road traffic collisions and managing a fleet doesn't always fall under the same banner, and definitely not in the same sort of authority or robustness as general health and safety. But to be fair, driving for work is, as we all know, those of us who are within the industry, but those who do not work in the industry probably don't realise that driving is the most dangerous work activity any of us will ever do. That's quite surprising. People will think, yeah, working underground, deep sea diving, dealing with electrics, all these type of things would be far more dangerous. Hypothetically, yes, but in reality, driving, you're 4 times more likely to die driving whilst at work in your vehicle, whether it's your own vehicle or a company vehicle, than you are to suffer any other sort of death in the workplace. So, yes, driving is serious, but not taken in the same way from a RIDDOR perspective, because it's still not RIDDOR reportable exercise in most circumstances. So I think, why do we not take these incidents involving our staff, our most valuable asset within the workplace, seriously?
Thank you very much, Andrew. Charlotte, what can you add to that, please?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the points that Andrew raises there, because as we know, if you have an accident in the warehouse or just in the workplace generally, and it becomes RIDDOR reportable and there is an investigation into that, and the health and safety executives, do seem a lot more interested in it. And then, of course, you look at the road traffic collisions and the fact that people drive for work, they're either like lorry drivers, HGV drivers, or I guess people who actually driving forms part of their job. But of course, you have people generally who drive as part of their everyday work anyway, even if it's to go and do another task. And I think people don't really realise what constitutes driving for work. And the health and safety executive are becoming more and more interested in the driving for work and the accidents and the injuries that are coming from collisions on the road.
Charlotte, I think that's a really good point. And again, what you've made, that why do we have so many incidents in the workplace driving for work? And I think it's those things that we have so many people with a driving license. We're all deemed to know how to drive because we have a license, but how up to date do we keep our skills for driving for work purposes? Anybody in other forms of industry, you, Charlotte, as a solicitor, me as an investigator, electrician, plumber, accountant, anybody will have to do a certain amount of training every year to keep their skills up to date. But what do we do regarding driving unless you're a professional driver? Most people driving for work are not professional drivers as such. They just hold a car license or a motorcycle license, not a vocational license. But how do they keep themselves up to date with what's going on? Driving skills, advanced motorist courses, But even again, do they read the highway code, Charlotte? How many times do we come across people who do not know or understand the highway code as it is today?
Too many times. And to pick up on that, Andrew, how many times have we stood in front of drivers, professional drivers and otherwise, who aren't up to date with the highway code, who perhaps have never read the highway code since they passed their test. And I think the more worrying thing you touched on there, we all have driving licenses, and not the professional drivers, even just drivers like you, like me, anybody who drives for work. And I think that's almost everybody in the country who are able to work. Not all, but the percentage will be very high. It's massively unregulated because anyone just gets their keys, gets in the car and goes to work, drives for work, commutes for work, or does thousands, tens of thousands of miles nationally to keep up with their job, such as a sales rep or managing director. And that isn't something that's regulated or checked up upon in the same way that a professional driver is. And I think those are the worries, really, that companies generally will think of drivers or people who drive for work as, say, lorry drivers or van drivers. But the reality is that anybody who drives for work, company car or their own car, should be under essentially the same rules, and certainly from a safety perspective, shouldn't they?
They should. And I think just the example you've highlighted there, I think what you've alluded to is that the vehicle, for a lot of people, is an office space these days. They're out and about on the road all the time, all day. They have a meeting, but we've got used to having so many meetings virtually over lockdown for the last 2 years. Getting back out to meet people is great, but the expectation to still do a day's work on top of maybe a 3 or 4 hour meeting once you got there, and people use that time within the vehicle to do office work, to do backup work, phone calls, whatever. And I think that creates the risk, I think, for most employers is that, as you said, company vehicles are regulated, even cars to a certain degree, but those who are driving their own vehicles, grey fleet, owner drivers, whatever we want to call them this day and age, they probably have more responsibility under health and safety legislation than just a private car user because it's their own vehicle. So I think they're the sort of things that we need to look at and people to understand that driving is a responsible issue, but those people need to have the knowledge and the experience to be able to drive safely. I suppose, again, what makes a good driver, Charlotte, from a legal perspective or for a company perspective? Is it just being able to manage and control a vehicle, or is it understanding the potential consequences to their actions if something does go wrong?
Well, yeah, because it isn't just about knowing how to drive a vehicle. It is obviously understanding that their actions have consequences, not only for themselves, but for potentially whoever they hit or come into collision with. And then, of course, for the company at large. But I think most people don't really have an understanding of the Road Traffic Act, of the legal obligations, and also of the consequences should anything go wrong. I think there's a huge misconception when it comes generally to road traffic collisions that there isn't or there shouldn't be any consequences if they're involved in what they deem as an accident. I think this word accident is used a lot, and I know, Andrew, you have an issue with it, and so do I, because effectively we know the police don't treat anything as an accident because collisions are avoidable. One way or the other, they're avoidable unless there's an act of God. And of course, we're talking a very small percentage there. So I think that's the difficulty where they say, well, actually, that's an accident, so nothing will happen to me and there won't be any consequences because I didn't do it on purpose. But actually, we know that in law under the Road Traffic Act, and we'll get to the various offences a little bit later in the podcast, but we know that there is no ingredient that says anything has to be deliberate, because that would then become a different offence, murder, manslaughter or otherwise. So I guess it's just to stress that offences under the Road Traffic Act, they're not deliberate. They don't need to be deliberate in any way. And I think there's that misconception, accident versus collision, isn't there, Andrew?
There is, very much so. And I think for me, when we ask that question, and we've asked it recently, Charlotte, in some sessions, what makes a good driver? A good manager makes a good driver, because most people driving for work are under the instructions of somebody above them who are asking them to do something on a daily basis. The driver may not even formulate their own routes, their own appointments on a daily basis. So they're under the control of somebody totally independent. From a legislation perspective, we think the driver ultimately is the person in charge of the vehicle at the time of the collision. But what has led up to that driver driving the way they were doing at the time of that collision? Is it a driver error or something the driver's done specifically themselves out of misjudgment, or again, sometimes deliberately? But is it something they've been forced to make a decision because of workload? And the book doesn't necessarily just stop with the driver, does it, Charlotte? When we're looking at the legislation, the driver does something, but if it's something that happens at work, we're going to be looking at route planning, we're going to be looking at appointments, we're going to be looking at rest breaks, regardless of whether they're professional drivers or not, and how that's managed and audited and what's the audit trail behind it. Because if there isn't an audit trail behind it, what are the consequences, Charlotte?
Well, that's absolutely on point there, because let's face it, yes, if the driver has a collision, the police are going to be all over that driver. And make no mistake about it, they're going to look into how they were actually driving and what decisions they made, both on the road physically and leading up. So rest breaks and things like that you allude to, and decisions that they've made the night before, for example, perhaps the sleep that they've got, what they've eaten and drunk in the last 24 hours. But it doesn't stop there, because if a company has not got the policies and procedures in place and implemented them and trained them out to all the drivers in terms of their responsibilities, in terms of the rest breaks that they should and are expected to take legally, in terms of the care that they need to show towards other road users, and have documented that so that the health and safety executive and or the police can see that the company have taken that seriously, then the company are also liable to investigation, as are the senior people within that company personally. So people such as the compliance officers or the transport manager, health and safety directors, chief executives, they're all the people that are going to be in the frame, potentially. And therefore, I always say this, that a company and people within the company need to be really confident that they've gone to bed at night thinking, well, okay, I can't control everything, but I can control what I can control. And that is, we know we've done absolutely everything we can, reasonably practicable, or reasonably expected of us, to inform our drivers of the risks, to understand that they understand the risks, and that they know what our policies are, and they're following them. And I think to evidence that, I always say, is key. Do it, but evidence that you've done it. And then you can hopefully go to sleep at night knowing that, yeah, a collision might happen, but you've done everything you can to cover yourselves within the company.
And I think that issue of evidence, so that sort of brings us round nicely to the word investigation. And why do we investigate incidents and not just collisions? And I think that's the big point we need to get people to understand, I think, as part of this podcast, is that a collision is a collision. It may just be a one-off type of collision that will never happen again. And the amount of learning from that collision can be limited. But people should not just rely on the police to do the investigation or their insurer to do the investigation. They need to do things themselves. But we also need to get people to understand that investigating the minor incidents are just as important, because we learn more from the minor incidents. And it's the minor incidents that sort of stress test your live document, the way the company runs. It's the policies and processes and procedures, as you said, because we will identify through the investigation process whether drivers are following what the policies and procedures are and how they've been trained out to them. And also, are the management doing the same thing? Are the management following through the processes and procedures and managing it properly, and reevaluating and revisiting the policies on a regular basis? Because we know ourselves, Charlotte, the amount of incidents that we deal with and that we're dealing with at the minute, the learnings from each one soon identify the trends where the policy isn't quite working the way it should, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And as you've said, you actually learn more from a more minor incident or from a series of more minor incidents that show a trend within a company. Because what that then does is identify your training requirements. It might identify your next CPC focus and training courses. And actually, you may well then, showing that you take that seriously as a company, you may well then prevent the really serious collision from happening or the really serious incident from happening. Because if you're looking into absolutely everything and taking learning points from that to then adapt and amend your systems that are in place, what better way to evidence that you're taking driving for work seriously and road risk seriously?
Yeah. And that's the word, isn't it? Seriously. Taking it seriously, because at the end of the day, it's not just your employee that is at risk. It's every other road user that out there using the road at any given time that your staff are out there on the road. And I think for me, just following through on who does investigations within organisations, yes, if we're doing them, but are we doing them thoroughly enough? Are they robust enough? Are they asking the right questions in the right way at the right time? Are the people who do the investigations internally under pressure from above to try and not identify things that the company have not followed through properly themselves? We need to be free. Investigations need to be free to go wherever the evidence takes it. And if it's good evidence, it will corroborate everything the company's doing to try and mitigate it themselves, looking after the drivers. If the evidence is not so good, then it's the learning curve. And I think that's what we need to look at from investigations, is that the investigator, whether it's an internal person or external person, should be the company's friend and not somebody to be feared, because we have to be objective when we do the investigations. We have to be objective when we pass the information through to you, Charlotte, to use in a defence perspective. But also, we have to be the honest best friend. We have to say it as it is. And that, I think, sometimes for people working internally, investigating internally doesn't happen because there's so much potential conflict or pressure from above, which, from your perspective, Charlotte, when it comes to defending, is not really any use at all, is it, if there's been pressure from above?
No, it's not. And actually, could I just make a point about investigation forms and forms that I've seen over the years, Andrew? Because I often say investigations, whether it be road traffic, and I've seen it in non-road traffic ones as well, so in the warehouse accidents and the such like, they're not a tick box exercise. And I don't say that with any particular criticism to companies, because I always say that a company's primary objective isn't investigating every incident that happens at work. They're there in business doing what they do, trying to make a profit and trying to run their business. The difficulty is that then they have so many other obligations upon them to investigate these incidents and road traffic collisions on top, and they become a tick box exercise because of time pressure, because of capability to carry out an investigation properly. And I've seen these forms, and I'm sure a few people listening, and Andrew, you will have seen them, that 4 lines long, tick, 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 let's get the investigation done. Let's write 4 lines as to what's happened. A lot of the time, they don't really even know what exactly has happened. Care isn't taken over the language used or the intonation or how something might be interpreted. It's then put on a shelf, job done, complete. And then when those forms are passed over from the insurance company, when a lawyer asks for them, and I'm not even really talking about a criminal investigation here that has far-flung consequences we'll talk about later on, but I'm even talking about from a civil claim perspective. That form's passed on to a solicitor who then thinks, well, great, I might have been able to defend this, but this particular form, because it hasn't been filled out properly and with care, has actually ruined chances of defending something, or ruined chances of getting a finding of contributory negligence, for example. And so what I would really stress is that if investigations are to be done in-house, that those people need to really be trained on how to do it. Not only that, they need to take some real care over what they're writing in the forms. And I think often outsourcing an investigation to somebody who is going to take care and is trained to look at a form like that can really save the company money and a headache in the long run.
So this is where investigations really come down to not just protecting the driver, not just protecting the management level within the organisation, it's brand protection, which for so many companies out there in this day and age with social media the way it is vitally, vitally important. And the brand can be really slated with social media very, very quickly when something happens. So you sort of led on to the point nicely for the crux of this sort of scenario, this podcast, and what Ant identified in the introduction, is that no matter how many investigations we do, something will ultimately happen within an organisation where the police do attend. And I think that is the question then, is what happens next? As you quite rightly say, well, no point me saying it. What's the scenario? What's your favourite scenario that companies should think about on a daily basis?
Thanks, Andrew. And you say my favourite scenario, and you've heard me talk about it a lot. And I think I do bang the drum a bit. And the reason that I do is that I just think it's vitally important, not only from a moral perspective for employers, but actually just from every perspective in terms of protecting the brand, as you've talked about, protecting the driver, protecting individuals within the company. The scenario is as follows. Do people listening and do people who have senior positions within companies, do you have a 24/7 process whereby your drivers, if they're involved in a serious or fatal collision, or in fact, any police attended collision, let's put it that way, because it can be somebody injured rather than fatally injured. Is there a process whereby those drivers have immediate access to criminal representation? So I'm talking about from a criminal lawyer. I'm not talking about from an insurance company. I'm not talking about first notification of loss, where they'll be interested in whether you need a hire vehicle or that kind of thing. They're interested in claims. I'm talking about somebody who's going to represent the interests of your driver and essentially of your company from the moment a collision occurs at the scene. And if you don't, why is that the case? And I often find that it's simply people don't know what they don't know. So it's either never happened to a company before, in which case it's not something they've thought about, and they just think the police will take it from there. They'll get the information and the process will just take its course. But actually, the truth of the matter is, you need to really seriously consider what your drivers do at the scene. What are they legally obliged to provide to the police, and what should they be saying to the police at the scene? Well, I can tell you two things. The only thing a driver should be confirming at the scene is their name, that is a legal requirement, and the vehicle that they were driving. Thereafter, a driver should not be speaking to the police at the scene as to what happened and guessing as to what happened. A driver is in severe shock. All they've been doing that day is driving to work, driving for the purposes of work. They haven't meant to come into conflict with anything. There's often a body on the floor. They feel incredibly guilty because their vehicle has caused it. Whether or not, by the way, they're criminally, legally guilty of it is an entirely different question. They don't know that at the time. The police don't know that at the time. But very quickly, that driver will find themselves in a matter of minutes, cautioned, taken to the police station, sometimes as a voluntary attender, but make no mistake, if you didn't go voluntarily, they would be arrested at that point, put in a police cell, left to think about it for a while, and then interviewed. You very rarely have anyone more vulnerable at that point. What processes has a company got in place to ensure that that driver has advice, legal advice, immediately from the scene, a 24/7 phone number that they can phone through to, or the transport manager can phone through to? And does everybody, top to bottom, know what that process is so that you're protecting the driver when they need it the most? Because morally, you absolutely should be doing that if somebody's driving for your company for work. And also, in terms of benefits to a company, you find out information quicker. You can contact the police because if you are representing that driver as a lawyer, you have a window into the police investigation. The police will tell the company nothing if they don't. Your vehicle's impounded. You're not seeing that for a long time. You don't know where your driver is. You've lost all control over the investigation. You've lost all control over what's released in the press in terms of protecting your brand. I just think it's really important for people to understand that representation of a driver from the moment the collision occurs, not a month down the line, not even an hour down the line, is one of the most crucial things that you should have in place as a company, Andrew.
It is. And before we go on to your final favourite topic of all, legal privilege, just clarify that point. What is the difference of 24/7 legal roadside assistance that shouldn't be mixed up with FNOL, first notification of loss for insurance?
So if you think you have 24/7 cover in place, please check that really carefully. Most of the time, your insurers may well have a 24/7 claims reporting line. That is entirely different to getting through to a criminally trained lawyer to represent your driver at a police station outside the road from the moment a collision occurs. First notification of loss is very different. It's in relation to claim only. They'll be wanting to see if they can sort out hire for the third party. They'll be wanting to see if they can sort getting you from the scene. It's all relating to claims. This is entirely different. It is a 24/7 phone number through to a lawyer who can advise your driver and speak to the police from the scene, then find the location, attend the police station, and ensure that that driver says nothing to the police before they have spoken with a lawyer, consulted with a lawyer, and the lawyer deals with that interview. The only thing a driver should be saying is their name and the vehicle that they were driving. They should then say, I'm sorry, I can't speak to you. I've been told I can't speak to you. I'm in shock. Please call this number if you won't allow me to. You have very limited time to do this. People talk about murder scenes, the police talk about murder, and they say it's the golden hour. This isn't even an hour here. It's a golden few minutes that you have before the police arrive at that scene to ensure that your driver gets through to somebody. That is the difference, and it's crucial that people understand the difference between the 24/7 crisis response number and FNOL that's provided by insurers.
And that's very clear with the two differences of the solutions and the services provided. I think also that employers need to give consideration to, because there'll be a lot of employees where English isn't their first language. So the same process should be considered for people where English isn't their first language to protect the company. Inferring or intimating, even a nod of the head can have consequences from what you're saying there, Charlotte. But I think also, again, if a driver, as you say, is in shock, how many times do we hear people trying to blame somebody else? It's the other party. It's the employer. It's my manager's done this. That, what you're saying now protects that scenario escalating. But also, the most important thing is the legal privilege of information, how that is not being able to be divulged to the police or the enforcement authorities. So how important is the client and solicitor legal privilege relationship?
Well, Andrew, you know, that is is it my second favourite topic or my favourite? I don't know. It changes. It's extremely important because as soon as something like that happens, companies want to investigate. There are often many cooks in the kitchen trying to write things down. Things are flying about everywhere over email chains. If a solicitor isn't involved and isn't dealing with that process, then legal privilege is lost. So therefore, the police can knock on the door, the health and safety executive can knock on the door of the officers, and they will say, I want to see everything you've got in relation to that. Okay? And they will take it. That, of course, can be very damaging because, as we've talked about, things are written down in haste. A lot of things are interpreted in a different way. So what can then happen is the police see something that perhaps contradicts what a driver may have said in an interview or what a solicitor may have put forward in an interview. If you have that process tight all the way along and your solicitor is consulted from the moment that something occurs, and your solicitor is carrying out that investigation together with the collision investigator, together with the company, but in conjunction with, any emails are entitled legally privileged, and it invokes that solicitor-client privilege whereby the police and the HSE cannot come and knock and take whatever documentation a company may have in relation to that collision. And the same with the telematics data and different bits and pieces. Now, yes, in a live potential criminal investigation, the police can clearly seize video footage from the vehicle. They can ask for that. But if it's done in conjunction with your solicitor, at the very least, at least your solicitor's seen it before they go in and represent the driver. If there is no process there and no communication there, the police seize that and nobody's seen it but them. And then you're constantly fighting with one hand tied behind your back. And that's not really the position you want to be in. So I think legal privilege is really important from that point of view. Just make sure that at all times somebody has control over the process, and that should be your lawyer.
And that's why people work with a solicitor instead of just working with a solicitor when the worst case scenario happens or is a requirement because the police are coming to the side of the road. Working with somebody like yourself is vitally important because you could sort of be embedded with the company to understand how it works, understand the policies and processes, and have access to information that normally you would be fighting for and fighting hard to get very, very quickly so you know what's going on. To have it to hand before something like this happens, how important is that?
Well, it's vitally important because it saves vital minutes and hours. Because if I know what a company process is, if I know what's embedded, if I know what the previous investigations and trends are saying, if I know how things have been implemented across the fleet, it's just far easier for me to be able to be on the front foot straight away. So although it's unusual, it's far easier for me to react from a proactive standpoint than simply from a reactive standpoint. I've always said, as a lawyer, we're generally a distressed purchase, and generally we're there when the worst happens. And, make no mistake about it, Andrew, you know that I always will be there when the worst happens. But ultimately, it's much easier for me to pick up if I've been there and embedded with the company from the outset so that I know what their procedures are. And it really is as easy as that.
And I think that's the strange thing. People don't see solicitors as proactive. Probably a bit of an oxymoron in most people's thoughts, Charlotte. But I think there's so much value in that, and so much value in you being involved in the investigation process for that legal privilege to go all the way through, and not just on one instant when the worst case scenario happens.
That's exactly it. I think it is, as you say, probably an oxymoron, but it's something that can and does happen. You and I are working with many clients who are invoking this, who are working well with it, and who are benefiting from it. And I think that's the difference between just reacting and being there at the beginning of the process.
Charlotte and Andrew, thank you very much for going into such great and comprehensive detail about what one ought to be doing, what one ought to be aware of in terms of policy around road traffic collisions. You've mentioned the term legal privilege several times, so I have to notify our audience that nothing that you've heard during this podcast actually constitutes legal advice. I found very interesting the distinction between the words accident and collision, because when I was younger, it was always referred to as a road traffic accident. But the way you referred to accident as something that people seem not to deem as particularly serious in terms of personal responsibility, very interesting. Also, the importance of investigating non-collision incidents, and I'll refer back to some videos that Andrew showed in the recent road driving risk webinar of poor driving practices that were captured on a vehicle camera that ended up with a fairly major collision. And also, another thing that you mentioned was a fair learning culture, also something that RSSB has done a lot of work on in terms of work on the railway, but also ought to be applied to road driving. And finally, to let our audience know that there will be a future podcast with even more details on how to carry out an investigation after a road traffic collision. I'd like to thank you all for listening this far, and until the next time, stay safe.